It all started with a simple promise to my kids. After months of begging, I finally gave in and decided to build them a small playhouse in our backyard. Nothing extravagant, just a modest wooden structure with a slide and a swing. My children, ages 7 and 9, were ecstatic. As an architect by profession, I wanted to create something special yet reasonable that would bring them joy without causing any neighborhood disturbances. I checked our homeowners association bylaws thoroughly before starting the project. Section 8.3 clearly stated that minor recreational structures under 8 feet in height are permitted in backyards, provided they are not visible from the street. Perfect. Our backyard was fenced, and the playhouse would only be 6 feet tall. I even drafted professional blueprints and kept everything meticulously within code. The weekend arrived, and I began construction with my brother-in-law's help. The kids were helping too, handing us nails and holding boards as we measured and cut. It was turning into a wonderful family project. Until I heard the unmistakable sound of a throat being cleared with aggressive intent behind me. In a sickeningly sweet voice, "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing?" I turned to find Patricia Wilson, or Karen as the neighborhood had collectively nicknamed her, standing at our gate with her arms crossed and her signature platinum blonde bob perfectly motionless despite the breeze. As the HOA president for the past 3 years, Patricia had developed quite the reputation for her zealous enforcement of rules, particularly rules that seemed to materialize whenever someone did something she personally disliked. "Building a playhouse for my kids," I replied pleasantly, wiping sweat from my brow. "Don't worry, I've checked the bylaws. It's completely within regulations." Patricia's eyes narrowed as she surveyed our work. "I don't recall approving any structure modifications for your property, and as you know, all external changes require HOA approval." I maintained my composure despite the immediate surge of annoyance. "Actually, Patricia, recreational structures under 8 feet don't require pre-approval according to Section 8.3. I've studied the bylaws carefully." The corners of her mouth twitched downward. "Well, I'm not sure that's correct. I'll have to review it myself. In the meantime, you should stop construction until you receive proper approval." My children were watching this exchange, their excitement visibly deflating. My daughter clutched her small hammer to her chest, looking crestfallen. That was when I decided I wouldn't let Patricia's power trip ruin our weekend. "I appreciate your concern," I said diplomatically, "but we're going to continue. If you find any specific bylaw we're violating, feel free to let me know in writing. Have a great day." I turned back to my work, effectively dismissing her. Patricia didn't move for several seconds. I could feel her glare boring into my back. "This isn't over," she finally said before marching away, already pulling out her phone. We finished the basic structure that afternoon. It wasn't fully complete, but it was stable enough for the kids to play in, and they were thrilled. We celebrated with ice cream and spent the evening planning how we'd paint it the next day. I thought the matter with Patricia might cause some paperwork headaches, but I wasn't prepared for what happened the following morning. At approximately 8 a.m., our doorbell rang repeatedly, followed by aggressive knocking. When I opened the door, still in my pajamas with coffee in hand, I found myself facing 2 police officers with Patricia standing smugly behind them. "Good morning, officers," I said, genuinely confused. "Sir, we received a 911 call about an unauthorized construction that's creating a safety hazard," the taller officer explained, looking somewhat uncomfortable. I nearly choked on my coffee. "A 911 call? For a children's playhouse?" Patricia stepped forward. "It's an unsecured structure that could collapse at any moment. Children could be injured or killed." Her voice rose dramatically on the last word. I invited the officers to inspect the playhouse, explaining that I was a licensed architect and had built the structure according to proper safety standards. As we walked through the house to the backyard, I quietly mentioned to the officers that I had followed all HOA regulations. The officers examined the playhouse thoroughly, while Patricia pointed out imaginary structural flaws. "See how it wobbles? And those nails are exposed. This is a death trap." It didn't wobble, and there were no exposed nails. The officers exchanged glances. "Sir," the second officer said after their inspection, "this structure appears to be perfectly safe and well constructed. There's no violation or safety concern that we can see." Patricia's face flushed red. But it wasn't approved by the HOA. He's breaking the rules. The first officer turned to her. Ma'am, that's a civil matter between the homeowner and your association, not a police emergency. In the future, please don't use emergency services for non-emergency situations. It's a misuse of resources and could potentially be considered a false report. As they prepared to leave, I thanked them for their time and apologized that they had been called out unnecessarily. Patricia remained in my front yard, fuming. You're getting a violation notice, she hissed, and the maximum fine. The committee will back me up on this. I smiled politely, looking forward to discussing it at the next meeting. Have a wonderful day, Patricia. True to her word, a violation notice appeared in my mailbox the next day, citing unauthorized structure and safety hazards, with a fine of $300. I immediately filed an appeal, attaching the relevant bylaw sections and photographs documenting that the Playhouse met all requirements. While waiting for the appeal process, Patricia launched a neighborhood campaign against my family. She sent emails to all residents warning about dangerous unauthorized structures and homeowners who think rules don't apply to them. She didn't name us directly, but everyone knew who she meant. She would walk by our house multiple times daily, taking photos of the Playhouse from different angles and making notes on her clipboard. The appeal meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that time, Patricia's harassment escalated. She sent daily reminder notices about the violation. She recruited several of her loyal HOA committee members to park across from our house and monitor who was using the Playhouse. One afternoon, I even caught her measuring our fence height with a tape measure, presumably looking for additional violations. My children began to feel uncomfortable playing outside with the constant surveillance. My son asked if we should just take down the Playhouse to make the angry lady go away. That was the final straw. I spent the evening reviewing not just our HOA bylaws but county regulations, property laws, and every relevant. The next morning, I visited the county permit office and then a lumber yard. When Patricia made her regular surveillance pass by our house that afternoon, I was in the oak tree taking measurements. She stopped abruptly, watching with visible confusion. "What are you doing now?" she called out, hands on her hips. "Research," I replied cheerfully, making another note on my tape measure. "You need to remove that Playhouse immediately. The fine is increasing daily," she warned. I climbed down from the tree and approached the fence, maintaining a pleasant expression. "Actually, Patricia, I've been meaning to thank you. If you hadn't been so concerned about the Playhouse, I never would have researched the regulations so thoroughly. Did you know that tree houses fall under different requirements than ground structures? Fascinating stuff." Her eyes widened slightly. "What are you talking about?" "Well, since you're so interested in proper procedures, I thought you'd like to know that I've just obtained a county permit for a treehouse. According to Section 12.7 of the HOA bylaws, structures with county permits supersede standard HOA restrictions." I held up the official permit document. "The appeal meeting tomorrow should be interesting." Patricia's face cycled through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally forced composure. "A treehouse still requires HOA approval for aesthetic consistency." "Of course," I agreed. "That's why I've prepared a complete proposal for the committee, including detailed architectural drawings that comply with every possible regulation. I've even included a color scheme that matches our approved exterior house paint." I paused. "Though the county permit already grants me building rights regardless of HOA decision, as established in the Jenkins v. Lakewood HOA case of 2017. Patricia stared at me, momentarily speechless. I could almost see the calculations happening behind her eyes as she realized I'd outmaneuvered her. "We'll see about that," she finally managed before storming off. The appeal meeting the next evening was packed. Word had spread about our conflict, and neighbors were curious to see the outcome. When my case came up, I calmly presented the facts. The original Playhouse had been within regulations. The emergency call had been deemed inappropriate by police, and now I had a county permit for a treehouse that by both legal precedent and our own bylaws was permitted regardless of HOA aesthetic approval. Furthermore, I continued, I believe the harassment my family has experienced constitutes a violation of Article 2 of our bylaws. All residents have the right to quiet enjoyment of their property without undue interference or harassment. The committee members looked uncomfortable. Patricia, sitting at the center of the table, was practically vibrating with rage. "This is absurd," she finally burst out. "He's trying to build some massive structure that will ruin neighborhood property values. Are we really going to let him get away with this on a technicality?" An older committee member, Mr. Jenkins, cleared his throat. "Patricia, it doesn't appear to be a technicality. He's followed proper procedures and obtained legal permits, and these architectural drawings," he examined my plans, "are actually quite impressive. It's a tasteful design that complies with safety standards." "And regarding the 911 call," added another committee member, Mrs. Chen, "we've received a notice from the county about misuse of emergency services with our HOA listed as the responsible party. They're warning that false reports can result in fines to our association." Patricia's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "You can't possibly be taking his side." Mr. Jenkins sighed. "This isn't about sides, Patricia. It's about following established rules and procedures, something you've always emphasized." He turned to me. "Your appeal is granted, the violation and fine are rescinded, and your permit for the tree house is acknowledged as valid by the association." The room erupted in murmurs. Several neighbors actually applauded. Patricia slammed her gavel repeatedly. "This meeting isn't over," she shouted. "We still have to vote on his treehouse aesthetic approval." Mrs. Chen touched Patricia's arm gently. "He doesn't actually need our approval with the county permit, Patricia. That's established in our bylaws." "Then we'll change the bylaws," Patricia declared. Mr. Jenkins shook his head. "Changes can't be applied retroactively to already approved projects." He addressed the room. "Let's take a 15-minute recess before continuing with other business." As people milled about during the break, I found myself surrounded by neighbors expressing support and sharing their own stories of run-ins with Patricia. Apparently, her zealous enforcement had made her few friends. When the meeting reconvened, there was a surprising addition to the agenda: discussion of HOA leadership conduct. Mr. Jenkins addressed the room solemnly. "It has come to the committee's attention that there may have been some concerning patterns in how rules have been enforced and emergency services utilized. Before proceeding, I'd like to inform everyone that the board received a letter today from the county regarding potential fines for misuse of 911 services, specifically related to non-emergency calls about neighborhood disputes." All eyes turned to Patricia, whose expression had shifted from anger to alarm. "Additionally," Mr. Jenkins continued, "several residents have filed complaints about selective enforcement of rules and harassment. Given these circumstances, I believe we need to vote on whether current leadership should continue." Patricia jumped to her feet. "This is a coup! You can't remove me based on one incident." "It's not just one incident, Patricia," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "We've been receiving complaints for months. The situation with this family was simply the most egregious example." A vote was called. In a shocking turn of events, Patricia was removed from her position as HOA president by a margin of 27-3. As the implications of what had just happened sank in, Patricia's composure finally shattered completely. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked, her carefully styled bob finally coming undone as she gestured wildly. "I've given 3 years of my life to this ungrateful community. I've maintained property values. I've preserved neighborhood character." The room fell silent as she collected her belongings with shaking hands, mascara beginning to streak down her face. "You'll regret this," she muttered. "You'll all regret this when the neighborhood goes to hell without me." As she stormed toward the exit, she paused beside my chair. "And you," she hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me, "I hope your precious treehouse falls apart in the first storm." The door slammed behind her with such force that the HOA meeting minutes fluttered off the table, scattered by the breeze of Patricia's final dramatic exit.